Thanks very much, Thomas, and I also want to thank you all for letting me take part into this nice colloquium. And as the title reads, in this talk, I will deal with two well-known theories, namely Kreisels' theory of informal rigor and Gödel's notion of absolute probability. And in spite of the high philosophical relevance, these theories have remained among those good philosophical ideas which nonetheless seem to be untreatable in a more precise mathematical way. And of course, this is not to deny that attempts have been made for giving Kreisels and Gödel's ideas a more precise characterization. But in this talk, I will follow a quite different strategy. Namely, rather than trying to provide a framework or a theory for Gödel's informal rigor or, for Kreisels' informal rigor or for Gödel's absolute probability, I aim at investigating whether some already existing theory comes conceptually close to informal rigor or to absolute probability. And of course, this theory may have been developed independently of the aim of giving Kreisels and Gödel's ideas a more precise characterization, but this may not impede that some of its basic tenets match those that Kreisel and Gödel had in mind. And the theory with respect to which I'm going to pursue this comparison is Prawitz's semantics. And as we shall see, this is because Prawitz employs a kind of semantic probability. And of course, many other theories exist which use probability in a semantic way. So in principle, the comparison I'm going to carry out could be carried out also for these other frameworks. So my choice of Prawitz is not meant to be exclusive. It may just be an example of a more general approach. So Kreisels' informal rigor and Gdels Absolute probability aim at two possibly intertwined goals. The first is that of bringing probability back into actual mathematical practice, namely at reconstructing and evaluating the heuristic rule of mathematical probability outside the reconstruction of this activity within the formalistic post-Fregean and or post-Hilbertian tradition. And of course, the formalistic attitude that develops in logic since Frege does not aim at reconstructing probability primarily, but aims at doing this for genuine foundational purposes. But as for example, Antonucci Marfori remarks, after Gdels incompleteness results, the foundational purposes were seemingly abandoned, while informal rigor remained as a kind of epistemic ideal. And the second aim of informal rigor and absolute probability is that of overstepping the limits of this approach. In what sense? In sense that once the inner limits of this approach have been acknowledged, one naturally wonders how these limits may be overcome. For example, by improving incomplete formal setups through the addition of new axioms and then by looking for these new axioms, or by reflecting upon general and structural principles of provability and so on. Now, of course, Gödel's and Turing's results, limiting results, are in the background here, and this holds for Turing much more than for Gödel, and this for essentially two reasons. The first is that both Kreisel and Gödel consider Turing's notion of computability as a kind of paradigm of formal rigor, and we shall see that this, in the case of Gödel, holds in a much stronger way. And the second reason is that Gödel's incompleteness results could be extended, which as known are based on Russell and Whitehead's system of principia, could be extended to any formal system only after Turing had provided a sufficiently wide notion of what a formal system setup is. And this is a point which is raised by Juliet Kennedy, and we shall see that it also connects with Gdels' notion of absoluteness and with Gödel's own position about Turing. So by now, it should be clear what informal and absolute means. Namely, informal rigor is a rigorous activity of proving results independently from, and so to say, outside of given formal setups. But as we shall see, this activity is based on formal results that can be proved about and within the formal setups, Whereas absoluteness, absolute provability, means provability in general, namely a formal free notion of probability and a universally applicable notion of probability. On the other hand, we have constructivist or intuitionistic inspired semantics, which are based on a notion of probability, which is clearly not reducible to the notion of formal derivability. And this is easily seen also if one considers that when one speaks of proofs in this framework, one does not conceive of proofs as combinatorial expressions out of a recursive set of axioms and rules, but proofs are to convey meaning or be harmonic with respect to meaning. So the real question of my talk is whether this is sufficient for establishing a connection with the Kreisels Informal Rigour or Gdels Absolute probability, but as said, I aim at investigating a narrower question, which is whether this is sufficient in the case of Prawitz's semantics. So as for Kreisel, in what follows, I will mainly focus on Kreisel's informal rigor and incompleteness proofs. Of course, many other papers from Kreisel could be relevant here. For example, the 1987 Church's thesis and the ideal of informal rigor. Anyway, I will not deal with these papers here. And in 1967, Kreisel starts with the formal rigor and says that the formal rigor consists in setting out formal rules and checking that a given derivation follows these rules. It does not apply to the discovery or choice of formal rules nor of notions. So here Kreisel is referring to Turing's notion of computability, which, as said, he considers as a kind of paradigm of formal rigor, and he uses Turing's notion of computability for a kind of ex negativo analysis. Namely, he says that formal rigor can check mechanically whether given consequences follow from given axioms and given rules, but it cannot, so to say, look beyond its own borders and discover new axioms or new notions. In contrast to formal rigor, we find the old-fashioned idea that one obtains rules and definitions by analyzing intuitive notions and putting down their properties. Intuitive notions are significant, be it in the external world. Sorry, here is word or in thought. So Kreisel is here remarking that as a matter of fact, one can go beyond the borders of a formal setup and discover new axioms and new notions. And it is very important to remark that Kreisel makes this possibility depend on the significance of some intuitive notions. And this should not be understood, I believe, simply in the sense that some incomplete formal setups may suggest, because of their incompleteness, some intuitive notions or properties of intuitive notions that can be used to improve these formal setups. Kreisel's 1967 examples show that completeness, that significance holds even in the case of completeness. For example, Kreisel's well-known squeezing argument, which establishes an informal connection between modal theoretic consequence, deductive consequence, and consequence as true final structures, and an intuitive notion of consequence as true final structures. This argument uses, in fact, completeness as a means for obtaining new insights. And ultimately, this depends on the fact that Kreisel is here referring significance not to derivations understood as combinatorial expressions out of a recursive set of axioms and rules, but he is referring significance to intuitive notions. Intuitive notions play a major role here. And this is because Kreisel attributes in formal rigor two main goals. The first one is analyzing intuitive notion in an as precise as possible way, whereas the second is extending this analysis by highlighting properties which may help improving formal setups and proving new results about them, for example, by deciding or at least clarifying some unsettled questions within and about them. And for what we shall see in a while, is very important to remark that Kreisel says that this activity should be carried out, I'm quoting, with the means available, namely based on the machinery of which we are in possession in connection with given formal setups, and with the knowledge which is engendered by this machinery. And this is the basis of a dialectic interaction between the formal and the intuitive level, which, as we shall see, informal rigor amounts to in the end. So if we had to list the ingredients of informal rigor, we should indicate at least the following. namely an intuitive notion, which we aim at analyzing, for example, set, consequence, and so on. Then we have some formal setups, possibly inspired by an intuitive notion, for example, nth order logic, nth order model theory, ZFC plus additional axioms, and so on. Then we have formal results concerning formal setups and possibly connecting different formal setups with each other. And in this case, we may, for example, mention completeness, incompleteness, or independence results, isomorphisms between theories, or categoricity results, for example, for classes of axioms with respect to certain classes of models. And finally, the fourth ingredient is informal results concerning the relation between a formal setup and an intuitive notion underlying it. And this ingredient is perhaps the less precise, but eventually the more fruitful. And in this case, we could, for example, mention Kreisel's well-known squeezing argument, which we have already mentioned, but also, for example, arguments for and against the Church-Turing thesis and the Church-Turing thesis itself, or axiomatizations for some of Brouwer's philosophical notions, or as we shall see also Gensen's claim that introductions fix the meaning of the logical constants. Informal rigor is the activity that permits us to connect these ingredients of course, according to one of the lines indicated above, namely analyzing intuitive notions and extending this analysis. And in this way, we can obtain new insights. And these insights cannot be obtained by staying within the formal setups, but as Kreisel says, these insights must be obtained through the means available, namely based on how formal setups are made and on the results we can prove within and about them. So Kreisel provides some examples to indicate what he understands by informal rigor, and these examples include reducibility and independence results in first and high order axiomatized theories, or completeness and incompleteness results for first and higher order logics, and axiomatizations of some intuitionistic notions, and so on. But overall, informal rigor seems to be a never-ending process, and this is because, as said, it is based on the shape of given formal configurations and on the formal or informal results we can prove within and about them. And thanks to this activity, we obtain new results which may be either formal or informal concerning the formal setups, the connection between different formal setups, and the relation between these setups and one or more intuitive notions underlying them. Or else we can discover, so to say, new intuitive properties of the intuitive notions. But then we can go back to the formal level and obtain so new formal setups and new formal or informal results concerning these setups, and so the process can continue. As for Gdel's notion of absolute provability, Gdel's main paper on absoluteness is the 1946 remarks before the Princeton Bicentennial Conference on Problems in Mathematics. And here Gödel refers absoluteness to three notions: computability, provability, and definability. And of these three notions, Gödel says, only the first, computability, has undergone an absolute treatment, thanks to the work on general recursiveness. But this may suggest, Gödel says, that provability and definability also undergo an absolute treatment. So in order to understand what Gödel means with absoluteness, we can see what he says about the absoluteness of the notion of computability. And what Gödel says is that with the concept of general recursiveness, one has for the first time succeeded in giving an absolute definition of an interesting epistemological notion, i.e., when not depending on the formalism chosen, it is not necessary to distinguish orders, and the diagonal procedure does not lead outside the defined notion. So what is absoluteness for Gödel? In the passage just quoted, Gödel seems to refer absoluteness to at least two things. The first is what Gandhi calls confluence, namely the fact that different formal definitions capture the same class of functions. So of course here the reference is to Turing's machines, or Church's lambda terms, or Rigour and Gödel recursive functions, and so on. But the second possibility is that by absoluteness, Gödel means absence of diagonalization. namely the fact that diagonalizing procedures do not expand the class of objects captured by the definition at issue. So Gödel ties absoluteness to independence from a chosen formalism, and if by this he understands confluence, this simply means that for him absoluteness means the fact that whichever formalism we choose, we end up having the same notion. But most authors agree that this is not sufficient for absoluteness to obtain. For this to be the case, we should at least endorse the Church-Turing thesis, granting a kind of completeness of different formal definitions of computability with respect to an intuitive notion of effectively computable function. But even in this case, we should grant that at least one among our formal definitions of computability is sufficient for granting the reliability of the Church-Turing thesis, namely is close enough to the intuitive notion of effectively computable to granting the completeness of these equivalent formal notions with the intuitive notions of effectively computable. And in fact, we shall see that this is actually the case for Gödel with reference to Turing's machine. So we shall come back to this issue later. But be that as it may, Gödel seems to refer absoluteness rather to absence of diagonalization, namely the fact that the fact that we cannot, given this definition, we cannot find objects which satisfy intuitive required properties and which are not definable in the language where the definition is given, and thus require more powerful languages for being captured or described. And I want to remark that both both confluence and absence of diagonalization are properties of all the sound notions of computability which we have mentioned so far, Turing's machines, Church's lambda terms, Rigour and Gödel recursive functions, and so on. And so a priori, we have no reason for looking at one of these notions as more absolute than another. And we shall see that Gödel has some preference, as a strong preference for Turing's notion. And this may be relating to what we have said about the Church-Turing thesis, but it also connects with Gödel's notion of absolute probability. So we shall come back to this topic in a while. But first, we have to see what Gödel says about absolute probability. And what he says is that it is well known that in whichever way you make probability precise by means of a formalism, the contemplation of this very formalism gives rise to new axioms which are exactly as evident and justified as those with which you started, and that this process of extension can be iterated into the transfinite. So there cannot exist any formalism which would embrace all these steps, but this does not exclude that all these steps, or at least all of them, which give something new for the domain of proposition in which you are interested, could be described and collected together in some non-constructive way. So in the first part of this passage, Gödel is of course referring to formal probability, namely to formal derivability, and eventually to the definition of a proof predicate to arithmetization in given languages. And of course, he's referring to incompleteness. And then he says that this incompleteness implies that we can extend incomplete formal system in a transfinite way, along the lines, for example, of Turing's and Fefferman's ordinal works on ordinal logics. And then he says that this implies that there cannot exist any formalism which will embrace all these steps. However, this does not exclude that all these steps could be described and collected together in some non-constructive way. And Gödel is here thinking about the possibility of extending axiomatized set theory through more and more powerful axioms of infinity. And it does not exclude the possibility that these axioms could be described in a unique way, which of course would be non-constructive and non-recursive, but this does not impede that we may find, for example, a pattern that all these axioms of infinity have to respect, for example, a logical form they are to have, and a reference to the fact that they are true. So in a way, this unique description encompasses a diagonalization step, namely the definition of a truth predicate for lower structures. But at the end of this 1946 paper, Gödel makes a quite obscure but most suggestive remark, He says that the concepts arrived at or envisaged were not absolute in the strictest sense, but only with respect to a certain system of things, namely the sets as conceived in axiomatic set theory. I.e., although there exist proofs and definitions not falling under these concepts, these definitions and proofs give or are to give nothing new within the domain of sets and the propositions expressible in terms of set, belonging, and the logical constants. The question whether the two epistemological concepts considered, namely provability and definability, because Gödel in this paper also deals with absolute definability, can be treated in a completely absolute way is of an entirely different nature. So the real question is, what does Gödel means with completely absolute way? Now, according to Krockow, this passage shows that Gödel conceives of absoluteness in at least two different ways. Weak absolute probability, what Krockow calls weak absolute probability, is the kind of absoluteness which we have been referring to so far, and it implies independence from languages and the impossibility of diagonalizing out of a complete notion which refer to a specific domain of things like sets or integers and so on. But there is also a stronger sense, which Krockow calls a strict absolute probability, which implies further independence from any domain of things or concepts. And in this strictest sense, we are thus not referring provability to what is provable in a specific domain, for example, sets, integers, and so on, but we are speaking of provability in the broadest possible sense. We are calling for a universally applicable concept of proof. Of course, Krockow's reconstruction is based on other Gödelian sources, in particular on some conversations which Gödel had with the Hao Wang, and which the latter reported in the well-known A Logical Journey from Gödel to Philosophy. And in one of these fragments, if I'm not wrong, the fragment number 8.61, Gödel says that the concept of formal is not to be necessarily understood in a Hilbertian way, namely as equivalent to formalistic, but, I'm quoting, the general concepts of logic occur in every subject. A formal science applies to every concept and every object. So, thanks to Krockow's interpretation, I think that Gödel's preference for Turing's notion of computability may be described in a much deeper way and also sharper way. It is not only that Turing's notion is closer to an intuitive notion of effectively computable and thus being confluent with respect to other non-diagonalizing notion, it grants the reliability of the Church-Turing thesis. The point is mainly that Turing's notion is for Gödel absolute in the strict sense, and then also in the weak one, because it is not defined, for example, for lambda terms or integers or whatever. Turing's notion amounts to a purely, say, positional approach where no linguistic or semantic notion is required. Of course, we have a language in Turing's notion of computability, but this language can be referred to any possible domain of things. It is not tied, for example, to the notion of application of a function, substitution of values in functions, and so on. So Turing's notion, in a sense, aims at reconstructing a dynamics of computing, namely the acts that must be performed to compute something, or better, to compute anything. And if we accept Krockow's reconstruction, while Gödel's weak notion of absolute probability comes close to Kreisel's Informal Rigour, because we have independence of language, absence of diagonalization, and so on, Gödel's notion of strict absolute probability is a much wider concept. Then we have Prawitz's semantics. I will not go through the details of these of definitions in Prawitz's semantics, because I presuppose that more or less all of you know these definitions. I just want to say that Prawitz's semantics comes in essentially two forms: semantics of valid arguments and theory of grounds. And these two theories share some issues and some concepts, but also differ on some important points, and both similarities and differences are motivated by philosophical reasons, but have influence on the way these theories are developed. And as for the semantics of valid arguments, as the name indicates, it is based on the notion of valid argument, of course, and it requires three ingredients. First, the notion of atomic base, which basically is a pair where the first element is usually first order language, and the second element is an atomic system. And atomic systems may be understood in different ways depending on what names. on one's aims, but usually Prawitz understands them as post-systems, namely as sets of production rules where premises and conclusion are meant to be atomic formulas. Then we have argument structures, which are tree structures whose nodes are meant to be arbitrary inferences, possibly discharging assumptions and binding variables. And finally, we have justifying functions, which are effective functions associated to inferences, which permit to transform arguments for a conclusion A from a set of undischarged assumptions gamma and with unbound variables x into arguments for the same conclusion and whose undischarged assumptions and unbound variables are contained in gamma and x respectively. Now, leaving out the definitions, I just want to remark that these definitions relies upon the Gensenian principle that introduction inferences are meaning constitutive, and so the introduction inferences are in Prawitz's valid argument semantics valid by default. They need not be reduced. And so with this established, the second clause in the definition saying that a closed non-canonical argument structure paired with a set of justifying functions is valid on an atomic base B if and only if it is reducible through the justifying functions to a closed canonical valid argument on B. This shows that the functions in J are actually justifying functions. Why? Because the elements of J are basically to show that we can dispense ourselves with non-canonical inferences without, so to say, altering the validity of the argument. And since this validity ultimately depends on how meaning is fixed by introduction rules, the justifying functions show that non-canonical inferences are harmonic with respect to this determination of meaning. In the theory grounds, we also have three ingredients, atomic bases, which are defined as before, and then we have typed functions, typed operations on grounds, namely operations with a type domain of grounds, which produce grounds in a type codomain. Operations of grounds are split in primitive and non-primitive operations. Primitive operations are meaning constitutive and fix what counts as a ground for formulas of different logical forms, of course, with reference to an atomic base. And they mirror Gensen's introduction rules and basically play the same role as introductions in Prawitz's valid arguments framework. Whereas non-canonical, non-primitive, operations on grounds are not meaning constitutive, but meaning justified. And this means that the behavior is fixed by an equation or by a system of equations showing how they have to be computed on given arguments, where some of these arguments, usually called privileged arguments, may have a primitive operation as outermost operation. Basically the account is I would say isomorphic to the valid arguments framework, and I'm not going through the details of the definitions of Prawitz's theory of grounds. What I want to remark is that if we stay within the valid arguments framework, our notion of inferential validity depends on the notion of valid argument, because the order is valid argument implies, so to say, valid inference, in the sense that an inference is said to be valid when it produces a valid argument when attached to valid arguments, basically. And if we accept to look at the Prawitzian valid argument as a proof, this means that valid inferences are defined in terms of proofs and not the other way around. And this seems to be an unnatural inversion of the usual understanding of a proof, because usually we understand of proofs as chains of valid inferences. So we take the notion of valid inferences prior to the notion of proof. But then if our notion of valid inference presupposes the notion of proof for it to be defined, our usual understanding becomes circular. So the theory of grounds undertakes the usual understanding of inferential validity. It defines valid inferences in terms of operations on grounds by saying that an inference is valid when an operation exists having the premises of the inference as type domain and the conclusion of the inference as type codomain, an operation on grounds, of course, and then proofs are defined as chains of valid inferences. Now I come to the comparison between Kreisel and Gödel on one hand and Prawitz on the other, and I will start with comparing Kreisels Informal Rigour and Prawitz's semantics. Now, as is well known, Prawitz's semantics stems from a generalization of some results Prawitz obtained for formal systems in Gensen's natural deduction style, namely Prawitz's normalization theorems. And what these theorems show is that non-normal derivations in given formal setups like intuitionistic logic, classical logic, and so on, can be reduced to a normal form where detours are eliminated, and with some most interesting structural properties, for example, normal form theorem or subformula principle, and so on. And just like Gensen's Hauptsatz for sequent calculi, Prawitz's proof-theoretic results are already beyond Hilbert's reductive proof theory and are described into what Prawitz will later call general proof theory. But this notwithstanding, they still belong, Prawitz's normalization theorems and connected results still belong to a level where provability is considered in a purely syntactical and genuinely formal way. But other results derived in Prawitz's normalization theory suggest that Prawitz's normalization theory may connect with the semantic attitude. And for this step to be undertaken, it seems one needs to adopt an informal point of view concerning a formal result. In particular, what Schroeder-Heister calls fundamental corollary of Prawitz's normalization theorem, saying that in intuitionistic logic, each closed derivation can be reduced to one ending with an introduction, is suggestive because it seems to confirm Gensen's well-known claim that introductions establish the meaning of the logical constants and that eliminations can be shown to be unique functions of the corresponding introductions. And observe that we are here speaking of a confirmation through a formal results of an essential informal claim. Now, of course, for the fundamental corollary to have a semantic weight, we need to conceive of normalization as a justification process concerning meaning and not simply as a detour elimination process. And there is a clear gap between considering normalization as a process that permits us to remove some redundant inference steps and considering it as a process that permits us to produce the denotation, namely the normal form of the derivation, to produce the normal form of a derivation, which is later interpreted as the denotation of the derivation. And apart from this, we must be confident that what is suggested by results like the fundamental corollary holds for arbitrary formal setups as well. Now, how can this be done? Of course, we cannot expect to be able to prove a supernormalization theorem that is normalization for every possible formal setup. As said, we need to speak of arbitrary inferences and arbitrary formal setups and consider chains of inferences no longer as objects in a formal system, but as proofs. And conceptually, derivations are not exactly the same as proofs. Derivations are obtained by combining mechanically given rules and axioms in a purely mechanical way, and this is formal rigor, while the latter have a deductive force stemming from meaning. And the derivation can, of course, be looked at as a proof, but this can happen only when axioms and rules receive some kind of semantic justification. And of course, for what's said above, when we move from derivations to proofs, we can also conceive of reduction rules for eliminating maximal formulas as justification functions associated to non-canonical inferences. Now, as we have said, the dialectic interaction between the intuitive and the formal level is what distinguishes Kreisels Informal Rigour, and we have just seen that same seems to hold for Prawitz's semantics. But the intuitive notions we have been referring to so far are not within Prawitz's semantics, they are rather presuppositions of these semantics. Of course, any semantics is inspired by some intuitive ideas, above all when one conceives of a semantics for a formal system as belonging in a Darmitian way to a wider theory of meaning, which underlies the formal semantics. But in Prawitz's semantics, there seems to be a strong connection between the formal level and the intuitive level, because and the semantic level, because the semantics is confirmed by the formal results and drawn from formal results that we can prove about formal setups. And what are these presuppositions in Prawitz's semantics? One of them we have already mentioned, it's Gensen's semantic claim. And this claim seems to be very in line with Dammet's investigations into theory of meaning, and in particular into the requisites that a satisfactory theory of meaning must comply with. And of course, here I'm referring to Dammet's idea that meaning should be accompanied by a description of a practice where knowledge of meaning can manifest itself, in line with the non-holistic interpretation of Wittgenstein's slogan meaning is use. And the epistemic constraint given by the connection between meaning and knowledge of meaning is a kind of informal axiom in a verificationist theory of meaning that play here yet in the same role as ambivalent and transcendental truth, notion of truth in a realist theory of meaning. A third presupposition is justification of deduction, namely the idea that the semantics should not only provide a precise notion of logical consequence, in this case a constructive one, of course, but also explain why deduction can exert its epistemic power upon us. And we have here a kind of distinction between an extensional way of looking at the aims of logic, namely logic should describe, produce, or single out a class of valid formulas and rules, and an intentional way of doing the same, namely logic should explain why formulas and rules are valid. And although the extensional approach is the prevailing one nowadays, the intentional approach is drawing more and more attention, and it seems to be much closer to a constructivist concern, but it is to be found already in Aristotle, I believe. For example, Aristotle's distinction between perfect and imperfect syllogisms. And finally, we have, of course, this is a partial list. We have other semantic presuppositions. A fourth presupposition may be transparency of deduction, namely the idea that in line with the aim of explaining the power of correct deduction, our notion of proof must be recognizable or most strongly decidable. Because if something is a proof, we should in principle be able to recognize or decide that it is. Now, these last two desiderata, justification of deduction and the transparency of deduction, have strong influences on the formal level of the mathematized semantics. For example, they have obliged Prawitz to modify his approach several times. For example, Prawitz's recent researches focus on what we may call the epistemic import of justifying functions. These functions cannot vacuously justify an inference, as happens, for example, in the case of an inference whose premises have no valid arguments or grounds on a given atomic base. And once again, what this epistemic relevance of justifying functions is to be is suggested by standard reduction rules for Gensen's eliminations in intuitionistic or classical logic. And these rules are satisfactory because they perfectly fit with the inversion principle, which in turn is based on a notion of containment between argument structures in Prawitz's formulation of the inversion principle. And once again, this feature, which is a formal feature, is generalized to a semantic principle, or better, to an heuristic principle, as Prawitz expresses himself now. So in general, Prawitz's project and others similar aims at bringing to the fore some general structural principles or proofs understood in a non-formal, above all not formalistic way. But the interaction between the formal and the intuitive level in Prawitz's semantics is not limited to semantics presuppositions. It also concerns the development of Prawitz's semantics and hence the way it interacts backwards with the formal level. And this is because Prawitz's notion of probability is much wider than that of derivability in a formal system, and this must be so depends, of course, on Gödel's incompleteness theorems. For example, when discussing in BHK-inspired the notion of proof, Prawitz says that although the clauses fixing what counts as a canonical proof for formulas of different logical kinds these clauses mirror Gensen's introduction rules, there is no formal system generating all the procedures that transform canonical proofs of A to canonical proofs of B. Of course, this depends on Gödel's incompleteness, and the reference is here to the implicational clause stating that a proof for A implies B is to be a procedure of the kind just described. And thus, in spite of the parallelism with Gensen, the rules for asserting a sentence do not amount to inference rules of any formal system. So, in the theory of grounds, this is much more evident, because in this case, Prawitz envisages formal languages of grounding whose terms denote grounds and operations on grounds. And we can conceive of these formal languages, I think, as Cary Howard, the linear translation of what in 1973 Prawitz calls justified deductive systems, namely systems whose inference rules come with the justifying function associated. And we may call closed a language of grounding with a recursive set of operational symbols. And in this case, Prawitz says, because of Gödel's incompleteness result already for first order arithmetical assertions, there is no closed language of grounds in which all grounds for them can be defined. And it is for this reason that Prawitz conceives of these languages of grounding as open. Namely, we can indefinitely add new operational symbols to these closed languages, but in the end, this simply means that the notion of ground is inexhaustibly wider than the notion of formal derivation. But on the other hand, this is only part of the story, because although the class of valid arguments and grounds oversteps any formal setup, each sound setup will provide the good instance of argumental validity and grounding. And this is not only in the sense that sound systems are correct with respect to the given semantics, it is also because the sound systems provide the straightforward examples for core notions. For example, as we have seen, reduction rules may suggest a general form of suitably strict, that is epistemically relevant, justifying functions, and outside the logic, mathematical induction shows that justifying at the first level, at the first order, justifying procedures may not only rely upon logical properties, but also on inner properties of the atomic base. And in turn, this may suggest how other fundamental notions should be developed or investigated. For example, atomic bases with different kinds of rules, or completeness, or a general theory of defining equations for the theory of grounds, or justifying functions for the valid argument setup, and so on. So, in his theory of grounds, as we have said, Prawitz introduces the idea of an open language of grounding. We have a closed language, but it may be insufficient for all the grounds on the atomic base which the language refers to be described, to be captured. So we need to add new operational symbols to this language to be able to express undecidable grounds, so to say, on a closed language. And we can understand this openness in at least two eventually equivalent ways. Either we have a very big, non-recursive language that contains all the possible operations and grounds on a given base, or we try to sketch a hierarchy of closed but progressively more powerful languages. And if we pursue this second strategy, we may ask which principles rule the passage from lower to upper nodes in the hierarchy. And as we have seen, some of these principles may be, for example, formal results concerning formal meta results concerning formal setups, for example, Gdels incompleteness. And in this case, the need of improving the expressive power of language through more and more powerful linguistic resources suggested by incompleteness, for example, adding to the atomic base a truth predicate or a reflection principle, seems to be very close to Kreisels' idea of formal setups for formal setups that, possibly compared to an intuitive idea, permit us to improve the formal level. And incidentally, also Gödel's weak absolute probability, the idea of extending set theory through axioms of infinity, which require these axioms to be true. So in a sense, a system cannot see its consistency, but on the other hand, we have intuitive grounds for this incompleteness, and hence we are allowed to improve the system through some resources which permit us to prove consistency at the lower level. But this does not only concern incompleteness, of course, because also when expanding a purely logical first order language of grounding, we may need principles which are not expressible in closed languages of grounding or in closed formal setups. For example, Dammet's assumption saying that grosso modo, each closed proof should reduce to a canonical form. And in this case, of course, we may have completeness, but this only means that we have a closed language of grounding which is capable of capturing an entire class of languages of grounding on a given base. Turning now to absolute probability, the link between Gödel and Prawitz is more difficult to be established. We seem to have two main differences concerning Gödel's position about the intertwinement of valid inferences and proofs, and Gödel's overall conception of absolute proofs, above all strict absolute proofs. So as we have seen, Prawitz's theory of grounds aims at complying with usual understanding of proofs as chains of valid inferences. Inferential validity is ground theoretically explained in a local way, through operations that transform grounds for the premises into grounds for the conclusion. And this is against the old idea endorsed in the valid arguments framework of understanding inferential validity in a global way, by saying that an inference is valid when it preserves the validity of the arguments to which it is attached. But this seems to be precisely how Gödel conceives of valid inferences. In his mathematic syntax of language, Gödel says that valid inference should, and let me quote from a paper I've written with Gabriela Crocco, it should not be understood as something that attached to a proof gives as a result a proof, where a proof is not understood in a formalistic way, namely as a sequence of expressions satisfying certain formal conditions, but as a sequence of thoughts convincing a sound mind. And this latter expression means that for Gödel, like in Prawitz semantics, there is no a priori bond on what inferences may be used for building proofs. These considerations may suggest that all things considered, Gödel comes rather closer to Prawitz's semantics of valid arguments. But in fact, this is not the case. Why? Because although in the valid arguments framework, inferential validity is explained in a global way, Prawitz's standpoint remains partly local because of the privileged role attributed, as we have seen, to introduction inferences. It is on the immediate validity of these inferences that Prawitz bases the inductive definition of valid arguments, which in turn grounds the definition of inferential validity in general. Whereas Gödel's point of view seems to be absolutely non-local, quasi-holistic. Why? Because non-locality, and I'm again quoting from the paper with Gabriela Crocco, non-locality seems to be the core of Gödel's argument. It implies that the acquisition of evidence for human subjects cannot be reduced to elementary steps given once and for all, and inference can become evident when we take into account the global, i.e. non-local, features of what has been proved on the basis of previous evidence. Thus, for Gödel, provability and hence inferential validity depend on global properties of proofs, and this is linked both with Gödel's Platonism and with Gödel's standpoint about Turing's computability. Gödel thinks that most concepts cannot become clear to us once and for all. They become sharper and sharper through a seemingly never-ending process. As for Turing's notion of computability, we know that Gödel considers it as a good example of an absolute notion of computability. But when we move from computability to provability, although led by the scheme of Turing's definition, we should renounce at least one aspect of Turing's computability, namely locality. As Crocco explains, this is because an analysis of provability should for Gödel imply systematic methods for actualizing our understanding of abstract concepts, and this may in turn require an infinity of distinguishable states of mind. But the deepest difference between Prawitz semantics and Gdels absolute probability, however, concerns the role of languages in proofs. So as we have said, Gödel thinks that an absolute notion of probability should be formalism independent, and this may be understood, this implies absence of diagonalization, and I think it may be understood in two different ways. What we may call a linguistic stability, namely our notion of absolute proof as properties that remain invariant with respect to the choice of the formalism where the notion is defined, and this is of course what we called confluence. Otherwise, formalism independence means more strongly that the notion is defined in a language-free setup. And the example is, of course, in this case, Turing's linguistic notion of Turing machine. And if we understand formalism independence as absence of language, Gödel's preference for Turing's notion of computability becomes sharp. Absence of language, in fact, is the linchpin of the connection between weak and strict absolute probability, and is thus what really distinguishes Turing's notion from other confluent notions such as Church's lambda terms, Rigour and Gödel functions, and so on. And of course, absence of language implies absence of diagonalization. Now, if by formalism independence Gödel just means confluence and of course absence of diagonalization, we may have a connection with Prawitz's semantics. Indeed, Prawitz's notion of provability can be formulated in essentially equivalent ways through different formalisms, and of course this stems from the Curry-Howard correspondence, establishing an isomorphic connection between Gensen's natural deduction and lambda calculus, although when trying to generalizing this correspondence, we may obtain a negative results. This is something that Prawitz shows in the paper titled On the Relation Between Heiting's and Gensen's Approaches to Meaning. However, as we have said, when he speaks of absolute probability, Gödel more likely thinks of formalism independence as absence of language. Now, how should we understand this absence of language? This is an open and indeed very suggestive question, but the answer seems to be a difficult one. Gödel remarks on both weak and strict absolute provability are very quick, and as Crocker remarks, it is not easy to guess what Gödel had in mind, except from what we can draw from what he says about Turing's computability, axioms of infinity for set theory, and universal applicability. However, I want to mention a line of research that I'm pursuing with Davide Catta from the LIRM laboratory of the Montpellier University. The idea is that Gdels' absence of language could be understood as untypedness. Namely, Gdels' absolute proofs are untyped. This should hold for strict absolute proofs, because strict absolute proofs must be universally applicable, while weak absolute proof may refer to a specific domain, like the universe of sets. And from this point of view, Gödel's notion of strict absolute provability may be understood as aiming at capturing the dynamics of proving, just like Turing's notion of computability is inspired not by computable functions per se, but by what makes a function computable. That is, by what we do when computing. And if one accepts this reconstruction, one easily sees that the link with Prawitz's provability is more difficult to be established, simply because although Prawitz's provability is meant to range over all possible atomic bases, a valid argument and the ground are always relative to this base. Indeed, grounds, for example, are typed objects. So to conclude, I think that Prawitz's provability may be understood in terms of Kreisels Informal Rigour and vice versa, while a link with Gödel is much more difficult to be established, but this is not to say that this link is impossible. It could, for example, be an indirect link from Prawitz to some framework which is close to Gödel's ideas. And always in this line of research with Davide Catta, an idea could be that of connecting Gödel's absolute probability with Girard's proof nets and the ludics, but of course this is not. So another question is whether the kind of comparison I've carried out so far with respect to Prawitz's semantics can be carried out also with respect to other proof-based semantics. But I think that a much more important question is the following. Informal rigor and absolute probability are usually understood as good ways for abandoning, as good reasons for abandoning what is sometimes called the standard view on proofs, namely, grosso modo, the idea that a proof is rigorous only if it is formalizable, and so understandable in a formalistic fashion. Now, no doubt the standard view of proofs has big limits, but it seems to me that neither Kreisel nor Gödel went that far with their proposals. Maybe the idea of taking proof-based semantics as instances of informal rigor or absolute probability may permit us to give due weight to the formalistic attitude without renouncing the fundamental results it obtained, and by extracting some core ideas it presupposes. And of course, this may constitute the topic of future works. And so, thank you.